Thank you for listening to the ThePPod from the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. Please note, due to the nature of this podcast, themes relating to the abuse and neglect of children are discussed, with the content being designed for an adult audience for educational purposes in order to protect children from harm. Therefore, listener discretion is advised and the content unsuitable for children.
Welcome to the ThePPod.
So, welcome back to the ThePPod, the partnership podcast from the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. Now, as you know, we've been doing a lot of work already within Somerset to launch the Somerset Trauma Informed Network. And that work continues. It will be a long journey, and we've only just started it. And if you've not caught any of the previous podcasts we've done around trauma informed practice, do go back and have a listen to those. Now, today I'm really excited to be talking to one of the leading experts in this field, who I have to say I was lucky enough to meet recently at a conference and spent some inspiring time talking to. And I'm so pleased that she came along to talk to us today. So today's guest is Dr. Karen Treisman, MBE, best-selling author, award-winning, highly specialist clinical psychologist and director of Safe Hands Thinking Minds. Her accolades include, amongst many, winner of the Winston Churchill Fellowship Award, and in 2018, Psychology Professional of the Year Award for Excellence in Attachment and Trauma, and winner of the Youth Psychology Professional in the year of 2020. Karen's also given TED Talks on the subject of trauma and continues to work with professionals from all around the country in all fields to improve and support trauma-informed practice across the country. So, Karen, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, because I know you are incredibly busy and about to be heading out the country soon to carry on your work abroad as well. So we really appreciate it. Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be here, and thank you for the very generous introduction.
Well, I've got to cover everything, which is not easy, I have to say, because when I was doing a bit of research for this, I was trying to keep it concise. But there's a lot that you've done here, isn't there? And a lot of books out, a lot of work that you've been doing in loads of different fields. So can we just start off? What sort of got you into this sort of field? Because you are now one of the country's leading experts. And so how did you where did you start off with this journey?
Goodness, it's always a tricky one, because I've got different answers for what brought me to be a psychologist, what brought me into fostering, what brought me into organisational change. And there's so much. But I suppose just to give a little answer, I think a lot of my childhood was spent in Africa, in various different parts of Africa, growing up, being exposed to lots of different cultures, but thinking about poverty, thinking about cultural humility, human rights, social justice. So that was sort of a real foundational experience. I had grandparents who were in the Holocaust. I had a mum who had multiple sclerosis and so had to sort of do lots of caring when I was younger. So lots of those things sort of drew me, and various other experiences, into sort of psychology. One of my first jobs was in a children's home, and working within a children's home as a residential worker. But huge amount for me, particularly the area of fostering and adoption, brought everything together. It brought being able to be creative. It brought working with trauma, loss, transitions. It worked with different systems. So there was so much within that world that sort of drew me. And then the organisational stuff was because I was seeing more and more kind of the impact of traumatized or trauma-soaked systems, and thinking about staff well-being and burnout. And I was such a big believer of how our environment shapes and influences us. So how can I focus not just at a one-to-one micro level, but at a macro level? So started, having worked in all sorts of systems myself, started looking more, how can we also look at sort of organisational culture? So that's a tiny little flavour, but some of the bits that brought me into the work.
That's really interesting you say that, actually. You mentioned about working in a children's home. Was that in the UK?
Yeah, it was in the UK.
It's interesting you say that, because I started off my career working in a children's home, and I was 21 at the time. And in hindsight now, that the trauma that the children and young people who lived there had been through, and I have to be completely honest with you, I had absolutely no idea about understanding any of that. You could see some of the behaviors, you could see some of the difficulties, and you just kind of got on with it and worked with it. But in all honesty, I've reflected a lot on this throughout my career. If I knew then what I know now, which is still only a tiny, tiny snippet in this area, it would have completely changed my approach, my practice, my understanding of the situation, and my responses to some of the children and young people who were clearly sort of going through real crisis in their lives, and understandably, and trying to provide a safe space for that whilst at the same time not really understanding it.
It's a really, and I'd say the same, Steve. I think I was 18 or 19 when I started that work. I was probably only a few years older than some of the kids that we were supporting, and had very little training, very little focus about sort of relationships, around trauma, so absolutely sort of, it was very behavioural in approaches. So completely, I think if I could go back and redo it or do it differently, or having this knowledge, I think to be able to do that therapeutic reparenting or that healing centered support, it would have looked and felt very different. Definitely.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's thank you. I just sort of launch us into the conversation then, really. And in terms of trauma, which we're going to be discussing today, and obviously we've put out a couple of podcasts already on this subject, but for anybody that's completely new to this, when we're sort of talking about trauma, when we're talking about trauma-informed practice, are you able to kind of give in a nutshell, kind of what it is we're talking about?
So I think in terms of trauma, it's really tricky because trauma is an umbrella term. It's massive. There's medical trauma, birth trauma, intergenerational trauma, cultural trauma, relational trauma, developmental trauma, disability trauma, poverty trauma. So it's a really umbrella term. And some people don't like the word. They use suffering or wound or hurt or harm. But I suppose in essence, what I'm often talking about, particularly in the context of relational and developmental trauma, often in social services, is thinking about an experience of someone feeling powerless, helpless, done to, trapped, overwhelmed, where there is, for their nervous system, their mind, their body, their gut, feeling unsafe, in danger, in threat. And there is a big difference between, I think, that kind of older thoughts of like trauma is a one-off incident, like a rape or something that happens to soldiers, but actually thinking about often it's that dosing, it's that layering, it's that being on a steady diet of feeling invalidated or criticized or unseen. So I think there's lots of different definitions and minutiae about different aspects, but in essence, it's, those different, and it doesn't have to be a trauma. It could be a stressor, pressure, adversity, but something that has been felt on a deep level that has impacted how often people see the world, feel in the world. Gabor Mate says trauma is not what happens to you, but it's what happens inside of you, if the body could talk. So yeah, that's that. I mean, in a teeny tiny nutshell, trauma.
Yeah, I think that's important because people often, like you say, people often think when we're talking about trauma, they'll think of a traumatic experience, like you say, a rape or an assault or a death, or and we often overlook, like you say, that sort of, I don't know, chipping away day after day after day throughout a lifetime sometimes, and the impact that has, and that cumulative kind of impact over time.
Huge. And I think that one-off, we call it single event trauma, is very important, and we can support that in a different way. But absolutely, when you think about someone, for example, it's that insidious, as you said, chipping away, cumulative, ongoing, dosing, day in and day out, being marinated in feeling invisible or invalidated or unseen or alone or in a place of toxic stress, and absolutely how that can change, particularly for a child, the formation of someone's identity or how they make sense of the world, and doing that without an adult to be their North Star or their anchor or their co-regulator, and during their development. So yeah, I think it's shifting sometimes the way people see it. But also in society, lots of people talk about, I'm traumatized because I missed the bus, and that doesn't mean that someone might be upset that they missed the bus, but actually, when someone goes down a trauma walk or a trauma time hole and really feels sort of in the grip of trauma, is different to feeling a little bit upset or distressed about a life event that's occurred.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that's, in a way, almost the bit that people possibly struggle with sometimes is, like, say, if you can see there was a traumatic event, that is because of this, therefore I can kind of rationalize it and expect. But also just the understanding that sometimes, somebody might say that it was a trauma, missing the bus, but actually genuinely for some people, it can be a really triggering incident. And I think sometimes people find that really difficult to understand. Well, why would that be such a biggie? Why you've just missed the bus. It's not a problem, really. You just get the next one.
Completely. And I think it is puzzling and confusing to be on the receiving end, and sometimes for someone to not be able to name or articulate. Bessel van der Kolk says, trauma often comes up as a response, not as a memory. But absolutely, for some people, it might not be missing the bus, but it might stir up or activate feeling life's unfair or life's unjust, or feeling like my emotional bandwidth is already stretched and that thing has just sent me over the edge. But it's like physical health, isn't it? If you've got your arm in plaster of Paris because you've broken it, people often have a lot more empathy, compassion, awareness than if you are talking about feeling really sad that people might not be able to physically, tangibly see or grasp onto. So when things are more abstract, it can be hard to sort of stay with that feeling in some ways.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because like you say, we talk about mental health and well-being a lot, but it is often tricky to pinpoint it down. Like, say, if you've got your arm in a cast or you've been in a car accident and you're bandaged up, you can see that, you can respond to that, can understand it. But like you say, that harm that somebody might have experienced over a period of time sometimes, which isn't necessarily visible, it's hard to kind of know how to understand it, how to respond to it sometimes. And do you find quite often with professionals who work with children or young people, or parents or adults, where they've experienced a lot of trauma, do you find sometimes, I don't know, professionals feel ill-equipped to kind of support those needs, or feel like they have to be an expert to fix everything?
Absolutely, yeah. I think both and. I think some people feel really overwhelmed and de-skilled, and the behaviours can be, difficult to be on the receiving end, whether it's rejecting behaviours or whether the child has, psychologically disconnected, or whether it's through expressed anger, or however that might look. I think people often will feel overwhelmed or de-skilled, or it activates our own emotional lingering or our own ghosts of the past. And I think, as you say, the other thing is thinking, oh God, only a psychologist can talk about trauma, or you have to be a qualified therapist, or I don't want to do more harm, or I don't want to, this discourse of open a tin of worms, or so yes, I think there is that real thing of feeling, what's the magic answer, or what do I do? And also, I think, as we know, trauma can often be not seen or not spoken about. So people can focus on the self-harm, or on the drugs or the alcohol or the child going missing, but not necessarily think about, what's going on underneath, or it's not what's wrong with them, it's what's happened to them, and to be curious instead of furious. So I think, there's a lot of misunderstanding, and lots of those experiences often, because they've not been disclosed or they've not been shared, or people think, they were many years ago, or they've been camouflaged, it can be hard. It can be hard for people to feel that they know how to respond or what to do in those situations.
We had,
and it's quite uncomfortable sometimes, for a foster carer, for example, to think of a child that's 3 years old being sexually abused. That is so unbearable sometimes, and so indescribable, that most people in society, it's the conspiracy of silence we need to avoid or it's very hard to connect with that sometimes.
No, definitely. And we had Mike from Lads Like Us come in and talk at our forum week earlier in the year. And something he said at the end of that, which kind of picks up from what you were saying, is he said often people are scared, professionals are scared of having that conversation because they feel they're going to open up a can of worms. And he said, what you've got to understand is you're not opening a can of worms. You're opening up a journey to healing and a pathway to healing. And that's what you've got to bear in mind all the time. But I think people do get worried of like, I'm going to say the wrong thing, or I'm going to say something and not have a clue what to do with this after I've opened it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Very much so.
I think as well, I think sometimes, obviously, in my role, we're dealing with around children's safeguarding. But I think just going back to what you were saying earlier about sort of trauma and these definitions of trauma being so vast and sort of intergenerational trauma, and I think that's a large part of it sometimes that we may sort of overlook, is actually understanding the trauma that parents may have experienced and that impacting on the child and how we respond to that parent. Do you kind of see that in your work a lot?
Massively so, and it's one of the things I'm most passionate about. I think that chain of pain, all those sort of ghosts and angels of the past. And absolutely, we're much more empathetic with a little 2-year-old, but when that 2-year-old becomes a 15-year-old and that 15-year-old becomes a parent, often it's that absolutely inner child work, or how do we care for the carers? And yeah, I think so often we sort of have these societal expectations, but if that parent has had a galaxy of missed opportunities, or their own experience to school is likely to shape or influence how they feel about going into school, or, how they were disciplined, or, how present or available was their parent or caregiver, or did they have someone to soothe or to regulate or to name their feelings? And so, we know that for some people, many don't, because many break the chain of pain, but we can repeat what we don't repair, or we can see, there's a quote by Britt that says, if you go to the theatre, the audience changes, but the plot can stay the same. That we can sometimes see these sort of trauma echoes and trauma being mirrored. So yeah, to me, that's why in any way you work, we can't have one for the kids and one for the adults. We need to have curiosity and wondering and compassion and dignity and respect for that whole cradle to grave, womb to tomb. It's for all of, to hold a fellow human in mind, even if they are a 35-year-old parent within social services.
And I think I've only really been sort of learning about trauma-informed practice relatively recently, but I think one of the big key things I've picked up quite early on is it's not a sort of single response. It's not, okay, you need to do this, and that's how you respond to this situation. What have it? It's just that it's that wider understanding, like you say, about all of your interactions right the way across an organization. And, if somebody's sitting there thinking, well, I only sit on the reception desk, when people come in, so this isn't really for me because I'm not working with children, or I'm not working with adults, or I'm not in adult mental health services, so it's not relevant for me. But it's that understanding that it goes right the way across systems, from when you first walk into a building. You get that feeling, don't you, as soon as you walk into a lot of buildings. And it's, what would you sort of say around that, in terms of that, to sort of get those messages across around that understanding about how everybody has a role to play with this, I guess?
Massively. And yeah, it's so much around that. But I suppose absolutely that it's everyone contributes to the culture, to a feeling, and if you take a school as an example, we know that it's the person who welcomes you as you come in, or who's there if you arrive late. It's the person who answers the phone. It's the librarian. It's the maintenance or the caretakers who are there when there's been property damage or fire alarms go off. It's the school nurse. It's the person who helps you cross the road, the lollipop person, or the person who rides the bus, or each person. That every interaction is an intervention is huge. And organizationally, it's, HR, for example, how do they do their disciplinary processes in a trauma-informed way, or performance management, or how do you do induction period? So there's so much, how do you have uncomfortable conversations when there's certain team dynamics? So the thing about trauma-informed is there are the core values of trauma-informed that then how those get infused or embodied will be different in different ways. But if you take, for example, something like choice, which is one of the values, the reason choice is important from a trauma lens is because in trauma, people often feel they didn't have a choice to the abuse. They've been powerless, helpless, silenced, voiceless, forced, pressured, done to. And therefore, we want to integrate that people feel they have agency and choice and options, whether that is what chair you sit on or how you'd like your name pronounced or what colour pen to use or when to have an appointment or to be able to opt out of having a conversation. That will look different in different contexts, but the core value is the same. It's just kind of put across at an organisational level.
And just for what you were saying, people, again, they sometimes do very small, very subtle things. Just going back to what name they want to be called by. I have to be honest with you. If somebody calls me Stephen, it really, I wouldn't say it puts my back up, but it makes me feel uncomfortable, particularly if they repeatedly use that. And it's funny, isn't it? Small things like that. For me, it's one letter in my name.
Completely.
It brings back memories of being told off usually by my mum when I was little, but when it became Stephen and not Steve. But it's small things like that where if you look at interactions, if you start calling somebody by a certain name or you're over familiar and call them a certain name and it's like, actually, that's not how I want to be addressed, or vice versa. It can really set that relationship off to a really bad footing, isn't it?
It really does. And I think that's the thing. There's obviously much bigger stuff in trauma-informed, which I think people often miss, around policy change, around the physical environment, around strategy, around leadership, around staff well-being and wellness. But on the minutiae, it's also those bits of one word can make a difference. A facial expression, how we do our letters that we send to people, all of those things. It's sort of looking at having a trauma lens and using the trauma-informed values on everything, the posters we put on the wall, how do we set up the toilets. So it's sort of going through. It almost, to me, gives not only a lens, but it gives some pillars and a framework to help sort of look and review at different aspects of the organisational practice. And some of it we'll be doing already, and some of it's little super tweaks or enriching or supercharging it up, that just small things can make a really big difference to people.
Well, so what in the work that you do around those sort of key messages to people, in terms of sort of what does make a difference, would you be able to kind of summarize those? If you kind of, I know it's a very, very difficult thing to do because the amount of work that you do in this field, but in terms of some of the things that people can do, you talked about sort of policy change there, but in terms of kind of broadly, what would you say are kind of some of those key bits that people really need to think about?
God, that is hard, Steve, because it so depends if I'm talking to foster carers or social workers or schools or asylum seeking refugee contexts. I suppose that the most important thing from an individual basis is, how are we helping language? I think that is one of the most important things. How are we thinking incredibly carefully about the labels that we use, the descriptive terms that we use, being mindful of vague descriptions and acronyms, giving people choice of words or language, not speaking for people, choice. How do we integrate choice? But I suppose one of the core bits is safety, and I mean multi-level, cultural, physical, emotional, relational. What are we doing to increase people's safety and decrease their feelings of threat or danger? But like on a one-to-one, how are we getting alongside people? How are we being hopeful bearers and hopeful sharers and hopeful disruptors, not in a toxic positivity way? How are we supporting people to feel truly humanized, not conveyor belts or statistics, but like really heard, listened, acknowledged, validated? And the big thing that I'm super passionate about that's often missed out in trauma is the multisensory element. I think so many people who think about trauma don't learn about how trauma can impact our speech and language, how trauma can impact our health and our body, and how words aren't enough. So whether you're doing house rules or doing a classroom or how you're working and supporting someone to regulate, how do you use multiple sort of sensory elements? So that's some of the practice bit. Organisationally, there's so many, but I think there's such an important bit of how do you model the model? How do you not just talk the talk, but walk the walk? So if you're talking about foster carers caring for children, do the social workers feel cared for? Is there an emphasis on staff well-being? Language, again, in the policies, in the procedures, in the assessment tools, the environment, do we do what we say? Are we transparent about it? Are we working collaboratively so that people don't feel that we're doing too? And are we aware of the abuse of power? So, I mean, there's hundreds of things, but I don't know if that gives a few bits.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you. And it's interesting that often people are worried about having those conversations. They're worried about being open, being transparent with somebody. Yeah, particularly when we talk about safeguarding concerns. It's something that comes up time and time again. People saying, well, I didn't really want to say something in case it kind of broke down the relationship I've got with them. And, I feel like we get on quite well. And I'm just a bit concerned that if I said something, it's going to make it really difficult. And it's interesting because what I always say to people is, well, how do you like to be treated? On a personal level, do you want people not to be open with you or just kind of do things behind your back? And it's like, well, no, of course I don't. It's like, well, why do we treat others like that then? It's often families that I've worked with where you can be open and, obviously you tailor that to the individual need, but you're open, you're transparent, you're honest, you're clear. And I've had people where there's been some real concerns and actually they've turned around and go, well, why has nobody ever told us before? They wanted to change things, but nobody told me why or what or how. And actually, it builds that relationship when you do that, isn't it? And I think there is something that sort of core point you made at the start there of that bit. But when you're sort of talking about safety being key, and I suppose when we're looking at things like Maslow's hierarchy of need, that's the foundation to it, isn't it? Really, and yet we skip that.
And no, we do. And it's really interesting because obviously one of the core values of trauma informed is transparency and honesty and clarity. And the reason that is because in trauma, so often people have felt, deceived, tricked, a conspiracy of silence, secrets. There's been a mismatch between people smile, but what they feel, or people say something and it doesn't fit, or that there's been a feeling of things happening underground or things being camouflaged. So how important it is that we communicate and we're transparent and we're upfront and honest. But there's often a fear from people or an apprehension. But it's a bit like I always say about, disciplinary processes. If you're a boss and you're like treating someone like they're your friend and you're doing a good job, mate, and all the rest, and then suddenly you get called into this formal HR disciplinary process, it almost feels like it adds more harm because you're like, oh my God, I've been promised something that hasn't delivered, or I didn't know, or the rug's been pulled from under me. Better to be able to have thorny conversations, say what you mean without being mean saying it, but that we're helping people to sort of have it in a titrated, gradual, co-regulating way. It's a bit like children in care. How many of our kids say they don't know why they're in care, or that people, in the context of suicide, that people say things like, they went for a long sleep or they died. And actually it comes from wanting to protect, but it's really important that we help people think about how do we have those thorny conversations in an honest, real, age-appropriate way, but better to do it with us where we can support someone and feel open and upfront than for people to feel tricked or deceived or overwhelmed and have the emotional tsunami of when they're told by their friends or they find out from someone else.
And understanding that even actually, if you are being open, transparent, if you're being very clear with somebody who you feel that you are, actually it's understanding that, again, that bigger context sometimes, that even though you may be, that may be against a backdrop of years and years and years of people not doing that, or like say smiling and saying one thing, but doing something completely differently. And, we talk about children being groomed and adults being groomed sometimes. And actually the impact that has, like you say, not just because of maybe sexual abuse that took place, but actually that destroying of trust, of faith, of looking to people who are there, supposed to be there to protect you, who actually don't do that. And so I think sometimes that can be a bit confusing or a bit frustrating for somebody working with a child or a young person or a parent, where you're kind of going, look, they're saying I'm not being honest with them, but I am. And I don't know what else I can say here. But I think sometimes it's just that understanding, isn't it, actually, that you may be, but there's this bigger backdrop to all of that you need to understand.
Absolutely. And look, trauma is often a violation of trust. And so we have to restore and reclaim and center and honor trust as a real. But absolutely, we know that sometimes what we say or how someone feels might be utterly different. And that might be how we're communicating it. That might be the way, that might be the relationship, that might be the landscape of all those other things. Or if you've learned people are not to be trusted, or people hurt me, or people harm me, that's really, really hard when someone else is coming in a different place. So yeah, there's so many kind of layers that can impact kind of how we communicate. And so I think, yeah, it's a huge area, isn't it, about how to have, if someone does get, I suppose I always say to my social workers, if someone does get upset and someone's like, I don't know what to do if someone gets upset, then that's our work. Then we need to support people to think about, well, what do you do to help and support someone who is feeling it's okay to be upset? What are we going to do to support people in that moment or in that experience? So yeah, lots of layers around that.
And do you find, and we talked a little bit about sort of organizational change being really essential to this, and do you find that, and again, just going back to what we're talking about in terms of that sort of safety, needing that foundation of that safety, and yet often as organizations, we're kind of driven to almost sort of bypass that straight away, to go, okay, well, you come in and you assess what the need is, and then you put in place an action plan, and then we work towards this action plan, and this is what we want to see, X, Y, and Z. Whereas actually, if we're not underpinning that by that understanding of needing that safety, needing to establish that foundation before you can do anything else, and just going back to the trauma recovery model that we talked about in our forum week of webinars there, and actually we can sometimes either sort of best case scenario just kind of miss really the understanding about what we need to be doing at a particular point in time, or kind of making it worse, I guess, from our approach, not being understanding.
Yeah, I think, we know there's a sort of priority matrix and sort of understanding what are my entry points and where do I start. And absolutely, if some people are just diving in, and I think there's a reality, isn't there? Because not everyone can have a year to build a therapeutic relationship. If I'm a social worker and I'm, on the front door or duty and I have to go in, I'm not going to be able to establish that safety. That's not realistic. But how I name that, how I acknowledge that, how I bring that into the room, how I do things in place, whether that's videos, how I give someone choice within that, how I'm respectful about, taking my shoes off or asking someone, all of those things, that's where the small things are. And owning, I am a stranger. I don't have an emotional x-ray. I don't know what it would be like being into your house. I wish I had much longer. I can't imagine what this is like. It's then thinking about, well, what are the bits that I can do within my role? And I think that's the bit. But I think organizationally, the bigger thing at the moment is because so many people are feeling themselves exhausted, burnt out, full up, depleted. It's emotional heavy lifting or the emotional labor of the work. And so I think we've got lots of staff who are feeling overwhelmed, unsupported, not valued, not appreciated. And then that's harder to be able to be, making decisions and thinking and being present and attuned. And many professionals are feeling, under-resourced and overstretched, and their hands are tied because they wish they came into the work to work in a different way and they're not being able to. So there's moral injury and soul wounds. And that's the organizational bit. It's like, how are you also looking at the organizational culture and the well-being of staff, so that it might be that you're trying to do safety with the people you work with, but how are you modeling that and doing safety with the people who work within the organization?
No, definitely. And I know you've been working in this field for many years now. I'm just wondering, are you seeing a change in this area? Are you seeing that understanding broadening out more, or do you still see sort of barriers there to it?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I'd say it's really varied. From the positive point of view, I'm seeing absolute areas of brilliance and some incredible practice going on, and some really exciting things happening in multiple different sectors. And there definitely is so much more awareness, so much more interest. There is so much more appetite. So I think that is absolutely. I think that there's a lot of people who have got much more of the basic understanding of sort of some ins and outs of some of the beginning bits of trauma. I think there are some people who have much, much further on their journey. I think, though, there's a lot of people who sort of have been on an hour or a half day of trauma-informed training and suddenly like, I'm trauma-informed, or labeling themselves as trauma-informed because you get money or can get tenders or it looks like the done thing to do. It's been diluted. There's a lot of people mis-selling or claiming it. And I think there's a massive difference between people might have an understanding, for example, about a few bits around adverse childhood experiences, but understanding the ins and outs, for example, of relational and development trauma from a shame point of view or a sensory point of view, or really going into the minutiae. I think there's many, many places who do not think about organizational culture and who might have the knowledge, a little bit of trauma sensitive, but not what do we do with this, or what are we bringing into this? And then there's all the layers of sort of might have a sense of some types of trauma, but not thinking about trauma and neurodiversity or trauma and cultural humility. So I think there's some organizations really committed to the journey and they are making huge strides. And there's organizations who are like, we'll do it as a tick box because Ofsted, is looking favorably, but it's not embedded, it's not infused, it's not meaningful. And we're in a society that people want more for less, or, something that's instant gratification. And I think, unfortunately, when it comes to trauma, there's bits, but it is an ongoing learning, developing, infusing, moving from knowing to doing to being.
Because we're, like I mentioned at the start of this, within Somerset, we're sort of fairly early on in this journey, I think, to be honest about it. And and what would you say in those? Obviously, you don't have to name names, but in those areas where you think, do you know what, they've got it, or they're getting, they are really on it, as opposed to those areas where you think it's not. I'm not convinced they're ever going to get there, sort of thing. What would you say sort of makes the difference? Would you, from your experience, go, actually, this is going to fly in this area?
I think one of the biggest things is the people, isn't it? Is having leadership, because without leadership, it's like pushing boulders uphill. I think it's having leaders and multiple people, because it can't be held in just one amazing cheerleader. You kind of need it to be infused or hardwired into the DNA of the organization. So I think if you've got leadership that's like who models the model, who is committed, who sees the understanding and the purpose, and who understands that it's going to be a journey, but the benefits that it will have. So I think amazing leadership makes a massive difference, and understanding it's a journey, not a final destination. I think there's quality over quantity makes a massive difference. So my local authorities that I work with, the ones that I think you're really seeing massive is when they've just narrowed it down to, do you know what? We're really just going to look at creating thinking spaces for our supervisors, supervising social workers, for example, and really work on their own well-being. Or I've got one local authority who's like, we're really struggling with our foster carer assessments. Let's really put a trauma lens into how we assess foster carers. I've got another local authority who's looking at transitions from child to adult, fostering to children's homes, and like really taking a trauma lens and meaningfully. Language, I think, makes a huge difference, because that goes across everything. Commitment to meaningful training, and training not just an hour here or an hour there, proper high quality training, and then an acknowledgement of, and what are we going to do with this training? How are we going to embed and infuse it. So there's so many elements, but I think those are some in the organizations that I'd say make a huge difference, and an openness to be vulnerable, an openness to say we don't know, or we're not sure, or we're stuck, or oh God, actually we've been doing that for 20 years and maybe we might have unintentionally be causing harm, or maybe we did that and we didn't realize. So that curiosity and humility and reflectiveness, and asking the people who we serve, do we ask birth parents their experience during proceedings, and birth relatives and foster carers and IROs and guardians and judges? Like, how are we meaningfully listening to people's voices?
It's interesting. We quite often ask families to be vulnerable with us, and we ask them quite personal things and ask them to be very honest with us. And like I say, be very vulnerable. Often we can shy away from us as organisations being honest and vulnerable sometimes, to say, actually, we might get this wrong sometimes, but we need to listen to that and be open to that and open to that change.
Massively so. And it's that whole modelling the model, isn't it? Not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. And I think absolutely we're much better at pointing the finger at other people, but also being able to be like, what's happened to us? What are we bringing? How is trauma being absorbed or soaked into our organisation? Are we stuck? Are we in a place of being reactive? Are we in a place of being hopeless? Are we into othering? What are we doing or bringing that might be adding harm or re-traumatizing? Or what are we doing to try and be healing or reflective? So there's so much around, if we're asking other people to do things, how are we trying to model and think about how does our culture reflect that? There's the James Baldwin quote, I don't believe what you say because I see what you do. And I think that's such an important thing. Like, what do we do as an organization? How do we make people feel? And how are our values actually like felt and embodied and infused, rather than just collecting dust on a shelf or just something on the email signature?
I know from hearing you talk before, and you mentioned it at the start of this podcast as well, you talk about marinating a lot, and children, young people who have been marinated in fear and harm, but also you sort of talk about us as organizations marinating children and young people and parents in that safety and that security and that approach towards them. I think it's a really, really nice phrase to use, kind of thinking about it in that way.
Yeah, thanks for remembering that and bring it up. I think it is, and it's that whole thing of those micro moments, and that we know that the way that our brains and our nervous systems work is by patterned, repetitive responses, it being activated over and over again, taking our brains to the gym, muscle memory. And so I think it is organizationally, it's like the more we're doing it over and over and over again and feeling it and sort of being that marinated and through osmosis, it becomes not what do we do, but who are we? And I think that's the ideal, that hopefully in however many years, people won't need to talk about trauma-informed, because it just will be the expectation and how people relate to each other, rather than having to sort of separate it in that way, because it would just become hardwired in organizations and in the DNA of the organization.
That's the holy grail, isn't it, that we'll aim for? So I just wonder, have you got any, I know, like I mentioned, I know you've done lots of work with lots of different organisations from right the way across the country and beyond. Have you got any sort of good practice examples that you can kind of leave us with, where you've gone, actually, do you know what, this is something, some work that I've done that I'm really proud of, or that has worked really well with an organisation?
Goodness, yeah, so many. I suppose at the moment I'm working with a lot in fostering, where we have really looked at fostering from entry to exit. So every area from a trauma lens, from how do we recruit foster carers? What are the qualities we're looking for not just love, for therapeutic reparenting, for healing-centered, for recovery-focused fostering? How are we assessing them in a trauma-informed way? What questions are we asking? How are we thinking about matching from a trauma lens? How are we thinking about the panel and how the panel's set up, from the room to the information that we go? How do we help with when a child transitions into foster care? What training are we giving the foster carers? How are we supporting the supervisor and social workers? We've looked at the language that's used on everything from the brochures, the material, the website. We look at when there's been an incident, how we're supporting, if there's been a disruption, what support we're putting in place, how we're supporting how they view and talk about birth parents, giving really tangible tools. So that's an example of sort of, and organisationally, how do the agency model the model and how do they support? So I think that's an example. We've looked at the physical environment of their office, policies, and how do policies harm or hinder. So that's one where it's really looking at sort of all of those different levels. But yeah, I could give you examples of in the police, in schools where we've done everything from looking at flexible seating, what are we doing to do trauma-informed toilets, what are we doing to think about how the wording, not using things like parents' evening, talking about how we support transitions, Christmas, the curriculum. So I think there's so many bits around the wider organisation that often people miss how important those bits, the recruitment, the disciplinary processes, the language that's used, the leadership. How do we support leaders to have a space and thinking spaces? That's another thing we do in the fostering agency. All the leaders have their own thinking space that they can also talk about management and leadership. So yeah, so many, but just to give a flavour.
Oh, it's brilliant. It's brilliant to hear, and say it's brilliant to see the work that you do. And I certainly came away inspired, I think, by seeing you talk recently at the conference, and so excited that you've taken a bit of time to come and talk to us about it today. It's very genuinely very much appreciated.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for all the fab work that you and the network are doing as well. It's lovely to be a little part of it.
It's appreciated. So just to kind of round us off, I know you're a very, very busy person. You've got lots of fingers in lots of pies. I know from talking to you, sort of lots of creativity flowing out from you all the time. What are you up to at the moment? What have you got going on?
Oh goodness! So yes, I've written lots of books. I think it's 14 now, and have 5 sets of cards. So you can look at all of those. At the moment, I'm working on 3 new books. One is called Taya the Tortoise, which is for children who clam up, retreat, bottle up, dissociate. So a creative workbook for those supporting children. I've got one called This Is Me, taken from The Greatest Showman, which is very much helping people to really understand what makes kids sparkle, what lights them up, the voice of the child, getting to know the child's unique personality, individuality. And I've got one which is The Unintended Consequences of Trauma-Informed, the thorny real-world myths, which has things like, is trauma-informed just being sweet, nice and kind? Or, my staff members weaponizing trauma-informed against me because I'm not letting them have a month off at Christmas? Or, can you still be trauma-informed if you're working in a traumatized system? So it's kind of all of those questions that people come for consultations for. I'm co-writing that with Dr. Mandy Davis, who's based in America. So yeah, those are the sort of writing projects. But yeah, lots of bits.
I might have to get that one and have a read through it because it sounds fascinating. I think am I right in thinking you're just about to, or just have released a book around trauma-informed practice within health services as well? Is that right?
Yes, I released that was a couple of months ago. So that's Trauma-Informed Healthcare, and it's super excited about that book. It's basically about how trauma impacts our bodies, our health, our sensory world from pregnancy ongoing, but how also we can get activated or things tapped into through medical procedures, medical trauma. It's really written for doctors, nurses, midwives, health visitors, anyone in the health profession, but actually loads of people have been saying it's been amazing to sort of validate their own experiences. I interviewed over 300 people about their experiences in healthcare and have shared some of the things that were painful and harmful and some of the things that really helped. So yeah, it's kind of taking some of the concepts from my big trauma-informed organisational books, but specifically focusing them into a healthcare setting.
Fantastic. Sounds brilliant. I will look it up. I know, because I know you've got a lot of published material out there, and it'll be great to kind of start picking through some of your more recent things. So brilliant. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come in and talk to us today. I really appreciate it, and hopefully it's inspired others to kind of pick this up and really sort of run with it. So thank you very much for everything you're doing, and for joining me today. And I'm sure we will do some work together again in the future.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and we'll speak to you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So thank you for joining us again today after our short break during the summer, and I hope you managed to have a bit of a break during that time as well. Now, if you've been inspired by listening to Karen today, you can find out more about the Trauma Informed Network in Somerset, as well as details on how to join the network and receive the Trauma Informed special newsletters. Just go to the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership website, where you'll find the page listed under the Working with Children tab. You can also find the direct link to that page in this episode description, where I've also linked to further information about Karen, her work, and the resources that she spoke to you about just now. Now, if you enjoyed listening to the ThePPod, we'd really appreciate it if you did take that bit of time to follow or subscribe to us on your chosen platform, or even better, leave us a review and let other people know about it. It really does help to spread the word. And talking about spreading the word, don't forget to tell other people about it and encourage them to join us here as well. Now, if you have any questions or comments arising from today's episode, or would like to be involved in future episodes, we'd love you to get in touch with us at theppod@somerset.gov.uk. Once again, I'd like to give a huge thank you to my guest today, Dr. Karen Treisman, and as always, I would like to thank you for listening. My name is Steve McAbee, and I'm the Training Manager for the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership, and I look forward to you joining us again next time at the ThePPod.
Let's work together to help keep children safe.